I'm going to get started, and I'm going to ask the group, does anybody have a particular question or comment that they'd really like to put forward?
I like your perception and your comments on what's happening with this division of Republican Party power.
Yeah, my feeling about that is that it is a massive failure of character, is the short answer. And politics is always different from ordinary life because these people are elected to represent their districts. And sometimes that means they go along with things that they don't personally agree with. But if you think about it, there's a legitimate way for that to happen because they are supposed to be representatives of the voters who put them there, not just there doing what they personally think is the right thing. And the challenge of being an ethical politician is balancing those two things. So you have to represent your voters, but you have to do it without betraying your core principles. Where I think this crosses the line is actually, I think, fairly clear. It's just that we've lost the ability to talk about morality with clarity, I believe, in our current culture. We're so uncomfortable with, at least if we're sort of, moderate and inclusive and tolerant, we're uncomfortable with dictating moral terms. But at a certain point, I think there are moral choices that are crucial in a democracy. And my view of that is that democracy is inclusive of people of all faiths and moral philosophies and people who are atheists and everybody, basically. But it does operate within a circle of basic moral values. And those include the belief in equality, freedom, justice, the rule of law. And if we don't believe in those values, then we don't believe in democracy. And that's the clear line for me. The Republicans now who are supporting Trump still and following even instructions from Trump, obviously, and supporting Marjorie Taylor Greene, and who still won't say that the election was not stolen, those people have committed not just mistakes, and they've not just bent the rules, but I think they're doing things that are morally wrong within the context of a democracy. And so that's what's happened, I think, is a moral collapse of the Republican Party. In my opinion, it's been going on for a very long time, decades now, I would say. This is the crisis point for it. And I think that at this point, unity is a waste of time. You can't negotiate with people who are doing things like this. This is a time for truth and accountability. So that's my view of that.
Thank you. No. Thank you, Tim.
Anybody else?
No, I have an interesting question. In Bermuda, we live in a parliamentary democracy, and it also suffers from the same amount of partisanship, and perhaps some would say even more so. Where do you think we need to go? What's our next step? How do we forgive and then condemn, or how do we move on?
No, I think it's a really important question. And, first of all, I'd say that Trumpism is not republicanism. And it has very little to do with political conservatism. And this is the larger problem, in my view, because it's essentially what it is ethno-nationalist populism, and now it's tipped over into full-on fascism, in my view. So ethno-nationalist, meaning the national identity is based on your ethnic tribe and your culture and race in many cases with Trumpism, rather than civic nationalism, which is what the United States is supposed to be all about, where you're an American citizen because you support the Constitution, not because you're a member of any particular race or culture. And that's combined with autocracy. Trump is an autocrat, which is leading us towards, or was leading us towards, fascism, and corruption. So it's kind of like the trifecta. It's basically the Vladimir Putin model, where you have a corrupt ethno-nationalist autocrat. So the thing is, there is such a thing as honest conservatism, and I believe we need the debate with conservatism in a democracy. We need a debate, at least between liberals and conservatives, and that debate will never really be resolved finally, because the tension between those two views is built into the attempt to have freedom and equality at the same time, in my view. In terms of what happens next, this is what I mean by I think we've crossed a moral line here. As many of you probably know because of my book and because I won't shut up on Facebook and elsewhere, I've been talking for a long time about the need to understand why people would support Trump, including why good people would have voted for Trump. Because the failure to understand that very different worldview is part of the reason why we became so divided. even though I'm a liberal, I think liberals bear some responsibility through failing to understand this very different worldview. However, with the crossing of this moral line, with the big lie about the stolen election, and then with the Capitol riot and the endorsement of QAnon and all that, there's no point trying to negotiate with people who are behaving that way. And so now I think we have to shift to moral clarity, not just intellectual understanding, but moral clarity. And that's why I think we need to start with truth and accountability, and then we need to go through a truth and reconciliation process like they did in post-apartheid South Africa, post-Troubles Northern Ireland, and post-war Germany. And it took decades in each case, and it was painful. We like to think Germany, sort of said, oh my God, when they woke up from the nightmare and realized they'd done something terrible, but it took them decades to come to terms with what had happened there. And I think South Africa moved faster, but it had been more than a century that they'd been living under apartheid, I believe. And then Northern Ireland had, multiple centuries of history, and that was an extremely painful process. I think actually that we needed truth and reconciliation, and almost had it after the Civil War ended in 1865. But very quickly, President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln was assassinated, and other leaders who were sympathetic to the South, sabotaged Reconstruction and invented the myth of the lost cause, where the Civil War, the South wasn't fighting for slavery, they were fighting for their noble traditional way of life and states' rights, which is all a lie. And we never, ever had the truth and reconciliation process, and we saw people with Confederate flags storming the Capitol just a few weeks ago. So I think we have to start with truth and accountability, and then prepare ourselves for the long truth and reconciliation process. I see Allison has her hand waved or raised.
Hi, thank you, Spencer, for this. Wouldn't it be valuable, when Nancy Pelosi took on the impeachment, the second impeachment, it was no surprise to me. She had to do that. A precedent had been set. She had to set a precedent, because, oh my gosh, if Obama's supporters had stormed the Capitol, the other side, the Republicans would have been up in arms. We can't. But many people are not seeing this. They're in an echo chamber of conspiracies and blah, blah. Yet those of us who were raised with American history know why she had to go forward with impeachment, because of the insurrection and the violation of constitutional norms that happened. And I'm not even, I'm 1% of the American history scholar you are, Spencer. Would it not make sense, and you have political clout, so maybe you can, you can pass a note to Joe for this. Would it not make sense for those, for President Biden, who has a bully pulpit, to maybe give a kind educational speech to the American public, all of those who profess to be patriots, which of two nations, as we all profess to be American patriots, to say, this is American history. We love y'all, hey, but this is what the Constitution said, and therefore accountability has to happen. Many of you may not have been given the benefit of American history, but it could be done in a way that is not offensive, but is more educational, because I don't think a lot of those people even knew that they were breaking the law.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It came as quite a shock to them that there were consequences for storming the Capitol and engaging in a violent riot and having people end up dying. And by the way, thanks for the kind comments about being a history scholar and a big deal in politics. Neither of them is really true. So if you dial those back by a couple of orders of magnitude, then you're back to me. But so, I used to think the same thing, and you'll still hear this a lot, that if we just improve civics education in school, for example, because the average person really, and in my experience, even the average really well-educated person has very little idea about how civics actually works. And I used to think that would be a big part of the solution. I no longer think it's nearly enough. I think it is important. I think we need to change our education system and put much more emphasis on training people to be citizens and a lot less on training them to be employees or managers, which is what I think school focuses on now. We should teach young people how to have a good life, which includes being a good citizen and being able to enjoy your freedom because you actually understand it. The reason I don't think it's enough, though, is that, and a lot of this came out of the research I did for the book, because when Trump won, I was as shocked as anybody else. And I started to notice that the support for him had a mystical quality. And this actually came up for me during an interview I was doing on China Global Television about a little over a year ago, I think. It was a panel discussion, and I was groping towards this explanation of this feeling about how I felt it was mystical. And this question of why don't they seem to understand that this country was founded on Enlightenment values of reason, and that's where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution came from, and it's fundamental to our concept of freedom and equality. It all came out of the Enlightenment, and before that, going back to the Roman Republic and the ancient Greeks. And what I realize is this is a completely different worldview and way of thinking and using language. And this is what Patriots of Two Nations is about. That worldview rejected the Enlightenment, which is what we never really appreciated. It's not that they don't understand it. So there isn't enough civics education in the world to fix that if they reject the premise. And their view of the nation of the United States, I talk about these two nations, their version of the nation has much more in common with a medieval monarchy, with Trump as the king who's anointed by God. And he's there because God put him there, and your loyalty is to him, not to some political entity called the state. And in fact, rational arguments that would attack your loyalty to the king must be fought off and resisted, and are inherently evil because you've sworn your loyalty to the king in the service of national destiny and the nobility of your culture, for some of them your race. It's completely irrational, but it's got a lot more in common with that. It's also got a lot more in common with religion, where you don't use words in a religious service to state logical propositions that you then support with, with factual propositions that you then analyze and support with logic. You use language as a mode of worship and to actually suspend your rational faculties and enter into a different state of mind. And it also has a lot in common with magic, where you make things true by asserting that they're true and using a certain combination of words that sound a certain way and have a certain rhythm, and that magic kind of works to fool people into thinking that something is actually happening to them or to actually have that experience. And then finally, marketing and sales, which are based essentially on magic and religion and the pre-Enlightenment way of thinking. And all of that is what's going on there. So the way to reach Trump supporters who haven't gone completely insane or who haven't just surrendered to the dark side, the way somebody like Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley or Kevin McCarthy has, is to connect on values and symbols and do stuff that's non-rational. Because the first thing that has to happen is you need to establish trust. The trouble is our country is broken down so severely that, as I say, education is not by itself, doesn't stand a chance of fixing this problem. We have to reestablish trust. I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll just, I'll end up reading my book to you. It looks like, could I move on to Kim?
I have wondered about that chasm in intelligence, and I think it's part of the resentment of Democrats and college-educated people, because I think in their personal experiences, they've probably been made to feel belittled. These people are often their bosses. And I think that this is an opportunity for them to get back at the people that they have felt owned by.
And that's one of those areas where I think liberals have to recognize we have played a role in creating the division. That doesn't mean that we have to both sides this, as they say, and both sides are equally at fault, because that's not true. However, one of the things that's happened over the course of history, I would say in parallel with the rise of the industrial age and then the subsequent ages leading down to the information age, is that we've created this meritocracy, which looks like it should be a great thing because theoretically you succeed just on the merits. So that's really inclusive, and it does away with hereditary wealth just being transferred down the generations, et cetera, theoretically. But in fact, it just ends up in many ways substituting one aristocracy for another. And we liberal meritocrats have developed a lot of the bad habits of traditional aristocracies. We Democrats, over just since the 60s even, I've noticed, have become more and more, or a segment of the Democratic Party has become more and more disconnected from its traditional working class roots, and is actually often appears to be embarrassed by working class people. The first thing that happens with, smart kid who can go to college, who's born in Indiana or somewhere, they take off for the coast. And they go to college and they start telling everybody how ridiculous the Midwest is. And this is a really common pattern. And when they run into, not very well-educated Trump supporters, especially if those people own guns, especially if those people go to church every Sunday, they just, very often the contempt is just dripping off of my fellow liberals, unfortunately. And even if it isn't, if you live in a society where you're constantly being reminded you're not making it because you're not really very smart, that's a very, very humiliating experience. And in some ways, a traditional aristocracy was better, because if you were born working class, if you were born a peasant or, a tradesperson or something, you knew you had no hope, basically, of that ever changing. So it was out of your hands. But the myth in America is all you have to do is work hard, and with your own pluck and determination, you too can be a millionaire or a billionaire. And if you aren't, it's your own damn fault. And that's just not true. And yet everywhere these folks turn, they're getting that message. And so, and shame is one of the most powerful and destructive human emotions there is. So unfortunately, often through obliviousness and unintentionally, I think a lot of liberals have been enraging these people for decades. And they really do hate liberals. And then you come along with a demagogue and dishonest media outlets telling them that not only do they look down at you and make fun of you and all that, but they're communists who are, who hate babies and want to kill them. And that's a big part of why we're where we are.
Yeah, I like where this is going in terms of the sort of drawing the distinction between this idea that the other side is stupid, and therefore that's why they're buying into that notion. Because I do think, first of all, in a democracy, obviously it's meant to work for everyone, the whole distribution of intelligence that we have. So by definition, the idea is that as you average it all out, you come up with the best solutions, not necessarily the best, scientific solution, but it's the best that group comes up with. And I also think, and have seen this time and again, that it's not so easy as to say everyone else on the other side is stupid for holding the beliefs that they do. One thought, and I put this in the chat as a tactical question, a question of tactics now in the House, since this division within the GOP exists. And the question on the Democratic side is, how do you handle that? How do you both actually encourage getting to the positive side of the more governing wing of the GOP, with whom one could actually come to an agreement on solutions to the problems that we face, which are enormous,
right?
And continue and actually put the wedge a little deeper between those two wings, because that split on between the crazies and the governing wing is kind of important. I mean, the GOP does have to sort itself out.
Yeah.
And the question is, what can we do on the Democratic side to encourage the sort without, again, maybe coming across as being condescending about it, so that there is a healthier opposition with whom we could work with, and that we have a similar sort that happened after, civil rights legislation passed and the Democrats lost the South, for example. That also was a sort that had to happen. The Democrats had to lose some folks.
Yeah.
That was necessary.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what we can do to help them cleanse themselves in order to actually get to some arrangement that works.
Such a great question. And I have a feeling we could do it the next hour just working on the implications of that. So I'll try to be real short. And I therefore probably won't do the question justice. But I think you're very right that, to point to the sort that happened in the 60s, not everybody may be fully familiar with the history of the Democratic Party, but before the 60s, the Democrats were the bad guys. They were the ones who were propping up slavery and then Jim Crow. And the Republican Party was founded in large part, not entirely, but in large part, to fight against slavery. And it was only starting in 1948, really, under Harry Truman, and then culminating in the 60s, at least the first wave of this transformation, where the Democrats finally renounced racists and let go of what was called the Solid South, which guaranteed the Democrats the majority in Congress, basically, term after term after term. And they immediately lost the South, as LBJ famously predicted back then when he was signing the Civil Rights Act. And the Republicans swooped in and said, oh, we'll take all those racists. And that's how they built their governing majority since the 60s, was by coded appeals to racism with talk of like Law and Order, which ended up only pretty much targeting Black and brown people, for example, and drug enforcement and all of that stuff, was exploiting racism, but it was kind of coded for a long time until Trump came along and said, why bother coding it? Let's just be racists and let's be hateful. And then he really unleashed, basically the dogs of hell. And another image for this is that political parties will often do what's known as riding the tiger. So they'll have a crazy base that they really are not comfortable with, but they need them to vote for them. And so they have to find a way to pander to the crazy base just enough to get them to vote for them, but not let them take over. And the risk is, as Winston Churchill pointed out a long time ago, if you try to ride a tiger, sooner or later that tiger is going to eat you. And that's another view of what happened with the Republican Party. They were trying to ride their extreme base, and the extreme base kind of woke up and self-organized and took over the party. And then Trump came along. That was basically the Tea Party. And then Trump came along and did that times 10. Now, the thing is, just as the Democrats had to have a reckoning with racism, and they renounced racism, and they took the political cost of saying goodbye to all those votes. That was an enormously politically courageous thing to do. And a lot of that can be laid at the feet of Lyndon Johnson. He knew what he was doing. And he knew what the cost was going to be, and he did it anyway, because as he said, why be president otherwise if you can't do something like this? The Republicans have to do the same thing. They have to have a reckoning. And I agree with Vince that we need to find a way to connect with the people who still have a conscience in the Republican Party, like my brother-in-law, Whitney, who joined the call. He was a member of Republican Voters Against Trump. We have to connect with those people and try to rebuild small L liberalism, which refers to basically the democratic tradition of enlightened debate, which includes, moderate conservatives, moderate liberals, everybody who believes in reasoned debate and the basic principles of democracy. Because the larger crisis, in my view, is the crisis of small L liberalism. We're losing that, and we're what's replacing it is illiberalism, which leads towards fascism on one end, or on the left, it leads towards leftist totalitarianism. Anyway, as I say, I could go on forever about that, and I think it's a fascinating topic.
If I could just punch in with a comment.
Okay.
In 1349, the bubonic plague ravaged Europe. It ravaged Europe, but there was underlying problems before that, and the plague just put the tin head on the whole deal. Within less than a generation, the peasants' revolt swept through Europe. And the whole notion of that the working man was no longer going to be bound to the feudal class changed. However, in UK, in Britain, King Stephen rode out to meet the peasants at the point when the state was at its most perilous point. And in a very, very kind and observant speech, took on board all the values of the peasants and brought them to a point where they put down their tools. I was intrigued to see on the assault of the capital a similar peasants' revolt. So now you have this situation where King Stephen, having found out who all the various rebels were, within a very short period of time, rounded them all up, had them executed, and then set about a whole new deal. So now we have the same situation right now. Nancy Pelosi was physically, emotionally, and otherwise threatened. Donald Trump's second in command, the second most important leader in America, was physically threatened. The state was being threatened by the president. The state now has the absolute responsibility to engender law and order, to go after these miscreants, to get to the leaders and cut the heads off of the snakes. Talk to the people, absolutely right, but cut the heads off of the snakes and show the people that there is absolutely no good thing that's going to come out of this. And, it's been done time and time and time again through history. And in this instance, I think in the American experience, talking it through and having a kumbaya moment is not going to do it. We have to cut the heads off of the snakes and then deal with the issues and deal with them with kindness, which has been said for all the other persons downstream.
Here's what I agree with. There's two different kinds of wrongdoers here. They're the people who were deluded into taking part of this riot, and some of them, they are just bad people. They've surrendered to the dark side. They wanted to hurt people. Some of them are just fools. As awful as it was, there was a comic aspect to this. Now, it's not acceptable what they did. And so anybody who committed a crime, I agree, even if it ends up being a misdemeanor, needs to be held to account just like anybody else would. But I think where we really agree is that the culpability is really with the ones who knew what they were doing, did it cynically with bad intentions and knew essentially they were trying to overthrow an election. And those people have to be held to account. And this is what I mean by accountability. Now, I think we have to do that without engaging in anything like retribution. So I was loving your King Stephen story, and I think that's an awesome historical reference. Except that I would hope in modern times King Stephen would make sure that the ringleaders faced a fair trial and went and suffered the results of justice, and as opposed to what tended to happen in the old days, where you just slaughter everybody and their family and the livestock and salt the earth and use that as an example so future generations would be terrified to try the same thing again. I don't think we can do that. And I think that this is what's powerful about truth and reconciliation as a process is it's based on restorative justice instead of retributive justice, because traditionally humanity always thought you had to punish sin and even torture people who did things that were wrong, because you were basically punishing and torturing the devil and trying to destroy evil. And that doesn't work. It just creates it's awful for one thing, but it also just perpetuates the cycle of vengeance and shame and more vengeance and more violence and more darkness. Whereas restorative justice tries to make things right. And that doesn't mean that everybody does the kumbaya moment, as you say. This is a third alternative. There is real accountability. The people who did bad things have to face what they did. And then they have to be led through a process of making it right. And in a one-on-one situation where a crime's been committed, the person who mugged the other person, for example, has to talk to the person they mugged and understand how much suffering they caused. And then their sentence involves trying to make restoration to the person who was harmed. So that's why I say I kind of agree with you, but I lean much more towards the sort of restorative justice model than the retributive justice model. And
I don't disagree for a moment, but however, I think it's most important for those persons downstream who have sort of followed along and have bought into an idea that they have followed the poison of some critical people, Fox News, American Online, or whatever the various characters are involved. They have deliberately poisoned the minds of a good number of good people. Yeah. There is consequences of that. And the restorative justice, no. These folks are better educated and they're more willful than the rest. They must be tackled with forthrightly. Because if you don't, the liberal democracy will not be seen to be strong enough to uphold the values that are liberal democracy. Because they're allowing assaulters to get away with it.
Oh yeah, no, those folks are building a business that's essentially an extractive industry. It's like strip mining democracy, essentially, is what those folks are doing. It's what they're doing is legal, but it's wrong, and it's extremely destructive. And I would say, you know, what I'm talking about doesn't mean that we're weak or soft. You know, part of this moral clarity means you stand up with clarity for what you believe is right, in this case, democracy, and you defend it against people who are trying to attack it. So in the case of like One America News and Newsmax and the opinion shows on Fox, which unfortunately is basically primetime on Fox, what they're doing is wrong. It's essentially, as I say, strip mining democracy. And I would say, let's strategically go after the business model and make it so that doesn't pay anymore. Make it so that becomes really expensive. I don't think there's a way in a democracy with a First Amendment to forbid them from saying a lot of things they're saying because our free speech protections are so broad. But we can certainly do things like boycott advertisers, find ways to highlight the shame and embarrassment of being in that line of work, of making your living that way. And this gets also, I think, to a larger subject of what's happened to our overall moral philosophy in the United States over the centuries. And I'm working on a new book that's going to focus a lot on what's known as civic virtue, which sounds like a dusty old phrase, but it's actually crucial to the functioning of a democracy. And in the great sweep of history, in my view, you can look at it, and this is extremely, you know, simplifying, but you can look at it as like three major stages, starting with morality located in divinity, you know, either gods or a monotheistic God. And then when we get through to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, you get, we tried to make morality based on reason, which is where we get the United States with, we believe in freedom and equality and justice. And unfortunately, what happened is that a lot of people, as I say, didn't really buy into that and or didn't find it satisfying because it left out a lot of the spiritual fullness that is present in a religion. You know, rationality feels spiritually empty compared to religion. And it leaves you feeling, you potentially living life like a bureaucrat where what you're doing makes perfect sense under the rules, but you're not sure what any of it means. And so in modernity, you had this attempt to base morality on reason, which essentially failed. And you had people trying all these different ways of coming up with non-religious forms of morality. And what ended up filling the gap in the United States, in my view, is the market. And now where we are is we essentially have what I consider to be a junk religion based on the market, where literally many Americans, it's as if the 10 Commandments include things like, if you can get away with it, that's great. You know, the point of life is to make the biggest profit you possibly can. If anybody gets in your way, crush them. These are essentially the values that many Americans, whether they recognize it or not, have absorbed, along with what they think of is their Christian faith or whatever other faith they think they belong to, or no faith. And so that's why I think we now have a situation where there are people who make the argument that they can do things like attack the Capitol or lie all day long on TV or deliberately fool gullible people into doing terrible things and scamming them out of their life savings and all of this stuff because, hey, it's business. And America is about business. And furthermore, it's freedom, because freedom means I get to do any damn thing I want. And that's, I think, you know, so the three sort of phases of history with divinity, reason, and now the market is basically our God. And behind the market is the self. It's essentially what I think of as the Messiah in the mirror. It's now the point of freedom is to do whatever the hell I want that makes me feel good, and God forbid anybody try to thwart my desires, because that's just wrong and repressive. And you find people on the left who think this way as well, and you find that message in Disney movies. We teach our kids, you know, let it go. It's like this anthem of basically express yourself, do what you want. If you can dream it, you can be it. And like, we've built this whole junk religion that's all about satisfying your own desires and has completely forgotten about any sense of community or moral standards that might last down the generations or any of that stuff. So we're looking at a heavy lift here, but in the short term, I think I agree with you. We have to recognize there's no some of this, some of that negotiation with people who are lying for a living, telling dangerous anti-democratic lies. or people who are engaging in violence because they're racist or just because they think that's fun. Those people just have to be stopped, and we have to do that, strategically and just hopefully without indulging in our own dark side and getting into vengeance and vicious retribution.
Spencer?
Yes.
This is Dennis Murphy.
Oh, hey, Dennis, thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to point out that there's more than one category of Trump supporter, and there's, you could call it levels, I suppose, but it seems that none of them will take in any data, that's for sure. But from my experience, I've seen the complete warriors, which are, they're just expressing their angst, and that's what we got out of the Capitol situation. And they're willing to go to war and die or whatever, or kill. And then there's a second category of those who are just coming from fear. They're also willing to probably be violent, but they're more putting off on the warriors, and they're coming from fear, and they're fed that fear. And then the third one is those passive people who are really intelligent and some of them pillars of the community and so forth, and keep friendships, but they support this tacitly. And all of them are equally detrimental to the situation. They all have power. And I think right now we just have to hope that the natural result is that people will be arrested for the warrior types. The ones in fear can be possibly pushed back into cowering. I don't know, because they're showing cowardice, and the other ones at some point have to come around to the reality by nature. You're not going to force it down any one of these categories, though. That's what I've experienced.
Right. Something I often say to clients is, we must love humanity, but we must also drastically lower our expectations. Mm-hmm. Again, I think one of the failures of the liberal tradition that I'm part of is this view of human nature that descends from Rousseau, which assumes that the natural state of a human being is innocence. And if people become corrupt or violent, it's because of a system that has harmed them. And, there's certainly some truth to that. I mean, the reason you have more crime in high poverty neighborhoods is not because poor people are bad or any worse than anybody else. It's because poverty makes crime more likely. But at the same time, it's a myth to think that if we eliminated poverty, we would eliminate crime, because there will still be this darkness in human nature. And there will also be widespread cowardice, as we might call it, people who are just too afraid to stand up or who just go along with the crowd, and whoever's in charge, they'll just follow instructions. And this is what history teaches us. If you look at the Soviet bloc, the behavior there, the behavior under the Nazis, the behavior under the Nazi occupation in France, behavior in the United States, which was an apartheid society until it was legally an apartheid society until the 1960s. People will just go along, including going along with great evil, because unfortunately, a lot of the average person, has this mix of noble and ignoble qualities. And one of the things that I think has emerged for me over the years working in politics is an understanding that people need more care than we want to think they do. I want people to be free, and I want them to have as much individual liberty as possible. But I also realize that we did not appreciate how much mutual care and also top-down care goes into, say, a functioning small town that's working well, where people are being cared for, people who get in trouble, there are people looking out for them and helping them out. People are doing favors for each other. And this mythology that, we should be a society of completely free, atomized individuals and fend for ourselves, it kind of serves the interests of the unscrupulous, but it doesn't serve the interests of the average person. And a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of people who are, maybe they're not very brave, or they're not very smart, or they shouldn't be so gullible, or they should have paid more attention in high school, or whatever it is. But they're human beings, and they need a lot more care than they've been getting. And so a lot of these folks who get sucked into QAnon, for example, which on the face of it is absolutely insane, but these people are much more vulnerable than we ever thought they would be. And even highly intelligent, educated people, I'm often shocked by how vulnerable they are to communications and media, which is basically my business. I mentioned magic earlier. If you know something about how marketing works, it's kind of like being a magician. You can change the way people think within minutes. It's frightening the number of times I've come up with a catchy phrase and had people repeating it back to me minutes later as if it was their original thought. So I think that we're going to have to recognize that a free society is also free as a society in addition to not to the individual, and there's much more care required for it. And one of the things that gives me optimism is Joe Biden, frankly. I think I've always loved Joe Biden, as has everybody who has ever met him. He's an amazingly good, just loving person. He's just terrific. Also very smart and very qualified. But I think he's just doing a great job of showing moral clarity, like I've been talking about, and not standing for stuff that's just wrong. And at the same time, constantly presenting a much more positive vision of what we could have, which appeals to the urge for goodness that's in just about everybody except the most damaged psychopath. So even these folks who have been supporting Trump, a lot of those folks, I'm convinced, will gradually start to come around. And when they see that, oh, here's a strong leader who I actually think is looking out for me, and he's appealing to hope and the light versus fear and the darkness. So I think, it's going to take a long time, but I kind of feel that's basically the way forward.
To your earlier comment about extreme wealth, I think it was Victor Hugo who said, behind every great fortune is an enormous crime.
Yeah, it's funny that phrase popped into my head earlier today. It's often true, of course, and much of the history of the nobility and down to the present involves putting a far more respectable face on something that was very, very unseemly at the dawn, at the creation. So a lot of fortunes are created through really tawdry means, and then the very next thing that happens is you build an enormously impressive house and start wearing incredibly impressive clothes and learn how to do everything in the absolute best of taste. And this is one of the ironies of the great homes of England, the stately homes of England, is how many of those were built in the 1700s. As we were shifting towards the rise of the industrial age and the bourgeoisie, and suddenly there are people making enormous amounts of money, and the first thing they did was build a stately home and start acting like aristocrats and making sure they were given titles and stuff. So I think there's a lot of truth in that, but I also feel that there's always a temptation to identify a class of people who are the bad guys. And this is something else that happens on the left, is we say, well, it's the rich, it's the capitalists, it's the corporations. And yes, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens when capitalism is too unregulated and becomes, too inhumane. And if people become rich, they start behaving like rich people, and often they become sort of arrogant and rude and dismissive and selfish. But that's, it's human nature. They're essentially, a rich person is a poor person with money. And the important principle for me is to recognize that in trying to locate evil in other people, in some other group of people, whoever those people are, we perpetuate it. And this is just sort of my philosophical view, that morality is going to need to start with us accepting that anytime we find evil in somebody else, we have to recognize that the point is not that that person is evil. That person may certainly be in the grip of evil. But what's happening is evil is manifesting itself in that person right now, but that same evil is in all of us. And awareness of it leads to recognition of it and allows us to interrupt the cycle. But if we conclude that the problem is capitalists, or the problem is Black people, or the problem is the gays, or the problem is any group, all we're doing is essentially guaranteeing that there's going to be more hatred and retribution going on through the generations. So in looking at, behind every great fortune is a great crime. I don't think that's actually true. There are people who've become rich through, honest talent, hard work, or just luck. The conclusion for me is not, and therefore rich people are bad. It's more like, let's make sure that we're aware of all the different ways people will abuse each other if they have the opportunity, and try to build a society where it's more humane. And people can succeed, but not at the expense of, literally strip mining Appalachia, or figuratively strip mining democracy, in line with the conversation this evening. This is a tough one, by the way, because I find that we all want to find the bad guy and punish the bad guy. And as liberals, I'm assuming it seems like most of us on the call are liberals, please correct me if I'm wrong. We tend to assume that because we think and we're rational, and our side of the political divide is based on inclusion and multiculturalism and tolerance and looking out for disadvantaged people, we tend to assume that we can't be the bad guys. We've overcome it. And we've overcome it through the power of reason, because we'd be very uncomfortable, most of us, with saying, well, the reason Democrats are good is because most of them are Christians, or most of them are Jews, or most of them are something else. That's obviously not at all what we can say, because we're pluralistic and inclusive. And so really we're left with, we're the good guys because basically we figured this all out, and we know it's just makes more sense to be kind to each other and inclusive and multicultural and have decent social safety net and all that. The risk there, I think, is what Jung called the denial of the shadow, and what Freud referred to as the death drive. He didn't call it the shadow, he called it the death drive. And the idea is that if you deny the presence of this darkness within yourself, if you deny that you yourself are capable of being selfish and greedy and exploitive and vindictive and all of that, you're actually at great risk of doing a lot of harm without realizing what you're doing. So liberals, for example, here's a classic example. Like San Francisco just drives me insane these days. I find it painful. I mean, we can't go to San Francisco pretty much anymore. It's just up the road about 100 miles, but because of the pandemic, but we used to go there fairly often. And it's becoming heartbreaking and enraging to go to San Francisco, because it's one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's very, very liberal. And there's the most desperate poverty and suffering on the streets all over the place, because they've built this meritocratic city where if you're rich, it's fantastic and it's beautiful and it's a wonderful way to live, if you don't mind stepping over mentally ill people and heroin addicts and just people who are completely flat broke and have no other options and who are living on the street. And that results essentially from zoning policy. And so it's not the easy to recognize, what we would call redneck, racist, obviously hateful person who's putting it all out there. It's much more polite. And because essentially the shadow elements of that have been denied and kind of smoothed over. And no, this is just a debate about zoning and neighborhood preservation or the environment or some mix of those things. And that's why we can't have multifamily housing in the incredibly densely populated and overpriced San Francisco residential market, right? But the result is nobody who isn't rich can afford to live in San Francisco anymore. Even people who have jobs and are not homeless on the street are having to drive in terrible traffic hours every day to come in and essentially serve the rich people. And, that is, in my view, unjust and cruel. And it's happening, it's being perpetrated largely by liberals, and it's not being looked at. because people just tell themselves it's zoning and environmental protection. And I agree that we have to have zoning controls and we have to protect the environment and neighborhood character, but certainly not this way. And that's an example, I think, of the denial of the shadow that can come about if you have this overly rationalistic worldview, which is one of the legacies of the Enlightenment. And in the most extreme versions of that, you get to like totalitarian communism like the Soviet Union or Cambodia or Maoist China, where everything's perfectly logical. It just results in millions of deaths or gulags, and imprisoning and torturing people who disagree with you, because we're building the new man in the new society, and it's all written down right here in the theory, and it makes perfect sense. And that's another way this can go very, very wrong.
Hey, Spencer. Hey, speaking for the San Francisco crowd, we live up here in San Francisco, and you're absolutely right.
That's a relief. I was afraid you were going to say you're deeply offended.
No, not at all. No, this is Natasha, by the way.
Hi.
Oh, hey, Natasha.
So yeah, we could have a whole separate conversation about San Francisco, but one of the things that when you asked the question in registering for tonight's Zoom meeting, I put out there was about the Confederate flag, and I think I see it a lot these days. Not here in San Francisco, but we drove up to Washington, saw it a lot through Oregon and Washington, and of course it was held aloft in the storming of the Capitol. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the meaning of that flag has become this day and age, and you referenced the false narrative or the myth of the
lost cause.
The lost cause, yeah, thank you. Earlier, and I obviously the origin of the flag and what the flag means to most people is different than I think what it means to the people who are waving it now.
Also, sorry, can you also maybe talk a little bit about, so we had dinner with a friend the other night, an African-American man who brought up the fact that we all watched the Dukes of Hazzard in the 1970s, and they were waving the Confederate flag on the show, and we as people of color didn't seem to faze us back then. But can you maybe talk about how that's kind of changed over the last 2 decades?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this is another big blind spot for liberals. So, in terms of rational reality, the Confederate flag is a symbol of slavery. It was a slave power, and that's what it was about. And yet, you say that to a lot of people who have a Confederate flag or want to keep the statues of Robert E. Lee and those folks, and they're deeply offended. And many of them will sincerely believe they are not racists. And will be outraged at the suggestion that racism has anything to do with this, and they will say it's about heritage and culture and history. And a lot of liberals respond to that with, "Oh, please, that's a pathetic lie. You're just a racist." And here's an example of why this divide is as bad as it is, because the people are using language differently, and they're actually inhabiting different worlds where one side is using symbols that are not necessarily rational, and the other side is making a rational argument and ignoring the symbolism. And in the book, I make the case, I think I know I make the case, I think I make it conclusively, frankly, that while the Civil War was, first of all, a fight just to defend slavery, it was just a matter of the brutal economics of slavery. It was also a revolt of the counter-enlightenment against the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the triumph of reason. The counter-enlightenment was the resistance to that I mentioned at the top of this meeting. And that wasn't just people just being reactionaries. There are a lot of very thoughtful people and like writers, philosophers, artists who resisted the Enlightenment because they thought it took the mystery and meaning and spirituality and beauty out of life and just reduced everything to data, essentially. So the English Romantic poets and the German Romantics like Goethe, they were counter-enlightenment figures. There were philosophers, and I mentioned several of them in the book. Edmund Burke, who's a philosopher and politician in England, and one of the sort of founding fathers of modern conservatism, of the sort of intellectually honest and ethical version of conservatism. There's a lot of people who are counter-Enlightenment people who are essentially arguing for everything that's outside of reason. There was a great Italian philosopher back in the 16 and 1700s, Giambattista Vico, who argued that science, yes, is extremely powerful, but science can only talk about what's scientific. And there's everything else is essentially what makes life worth living. It's the meaning, the mystery, the beauty, and science has nothing to say about that and can have nothing to say about that. Now, the way you talk about that stuff is through art or religion or culture. And that all of those things are done, those forms of communication are done through symbol and ritual. And the fact that it doesn't actually add up logically is completely beside the point. So the South was a counter-Enlightenment culture. And if you look at the history of the counter-Enlightenment versus the Enlightenment, you can see it's a classically counter-Enlightenment culture because they're always based on ties to the land. They tend to be agrarian. They tend to have an aristocracy. They really highly value tradition and the family line and culture and cultural identity. Now, racism and slavery fit right into that, unfortunately. It doesn't mean that counter-Enlightenment people are always awful people, but some of them are. And it makes a home for slavery, because if you believe that people have an essential nature and that some cultures are better than others and some races are better than others, then slavery fits right in that. But so the Civil War was first of all about slavery, but it was also a revolt of a counter-Enlightenment nation against the Enlightenment North, which was heavily rationalistic, industrialized, financialized, and it really stood for much of what the counter-Enlightenment finds kind of horrifying. It's soulless, it's powerful, but it's inhuman and relentless and cold and industrialized, and everything's about money and nothing's about culture or family ties or the stuff that we actually care about in our hearts and our guts. So with the Confederate flag, that's a lot of what's there. They are talking about Southern tradition. They're talking about what Southern food tastes like, for example, which if you've ever eaten, that's immediately, you're like, suddenly you get it. If you've sat around with Southerners having a Southern home-cooked meal, and just the natural sort of friendliness, whether they're white or black or wherever they come from in the South, there is this Southern culture thing that's incredibly warm and enveloping, and it has all this tradition and is really kind of beautiful in many ways. So a lot of them, they're waving the Confederate flag, or they want to keep their statues of Robert E. Lee and these people because of that. That's that. And when we come in and say, okay, those statues have to come down today, and it's now illegal to fly the Confederate flag. Okay, well, we're right about the history, and we're right about slavery and the fact that those people, and those are statues to people who committed treason against the United States to defend slavery. We're right about that. But something I often tell my liberal friends is being right is nowhere near enough. That's just the beginning. If you're trying to persuade people and your way of persuading them is to say, you're wrong and I'm right, and here's all the data. Well, try that in your personal relationships. Try it in your marriage if you're married, right? If your partner is upset about something and your response to that is, look, don't bother, you're just wrong. Even if you're sure you're right, you're making a terrible mistake. So I actually think there are many, many examples of where liberals could have done a much better job of recognizing it's nowhere near enough to be right. And you can say, wait a minute, we have to stop this Confederate crap right now. Yeah, but would you rather actually have it stop and build support for it really stopping, or do you want to just sort of put a lid on it, and which is what happened in the United States? It became, socially unacceptable to be racist. And so people stopped showing that they were racist, but that didn't make racism go away. And I actually think this is a problem with the way abortion rights went. I believe in abortion rights, but I think that proceeding through the courts ended up being a mistake, because I think it would have been better to build support. Because you're dealing with people who believe you're killing a child if you have an abortion. Now you can say, well, you're just wrong. But again, you're not going to persuade anybody that way. Obama actually has been strong on this for a long time. He feels like the civil rights movement kind of went off the rails by relying too much on the courts. And it was more successful to do what Gandhi did and Martin Luther King did and Obama himself did, which was to appeal to people's higher values and help them see, it's not that you shouldn't stop being racist because it's illegal, or socially unacceptable. Help them see that we're talking about our fellow human beings here. And if we believe that everybody is equal, or if we're religious and we say everybody's created in God's image, surely we can't mistreat our fellow human beings because of, their skin color or their religion or whatever. And by appealing to that, then you've established, I talked earlier about rebuilding trust first and based on values, not rational arguments. Here's an example, right? Because you can get people to come around to that, they'll say, oh yeah, and then if they meet some people who are different from them, which is often a problem in these neighborhoods because they've never actually met, they almost don't know immigrants or they don't know Black people, or if they do, they're somebody who works in the store or something. But once you actually establish those values and people start to see each other as human beings, they actually do want to be good to their fellow human beings. Right. And they do start to say, oh, yeah, I get it that this, this flag or this statue, I get that I see why that's so hurtful to you, and I wouldn't want to hurt anybody. So yeah, let's talk about what we can do about that. And that's different from, okay, the statues are coming down and the flag's illegal.
Right, totally. Thank you, Spencer. That was awesome. And just to bring it back to San Francisco, the patron saint of our city, and Mark Benioff likes to bring this up a lot when he's talking to the city. He talked about how we need to treat each other as equals, and he also talks about the homeless problem we have here, and how if we just looked at those people as our brothers and sisters, and like set aside politics or the zoning or whatever, those are our brothers and sisters. We're stepping over. So,
and that's a crisis. How can that not be a crisis, right?
Yeah.
And, there's, by the way, lately I'm reading a terrific book from some years ago called The Revolt of the Elites by Christopher Lasch, Lasch. And he's terrific on the subject of how the left kind of went off these rails and became this meritocratic elite, and successful, whether actually on the left or the right, successful people with a lot of money and professional prestige started to separate themselves from the rest of American society. And that's been a big problem. It didn't used to be so true. The rich people in town lived basically in the same neighborhoods, roughly, in a small town, and they went to the same churches and went to the same town meetings and stuff, and felt more of a sense of being part of a community. Tony Judd, J-U-D-T, is also terrific on this subject. He spent much of his life as a Marxist, I believe, and ended up as kind of a social democrat. And he's really good on the subject of how the left seems to have lost that sense of community responsibility. We talk about it all the time, right? We're always talking about the community and how it takes a village. And then we retreat to our incredibly expensive real estate where no poor people can possibly afford to be unless they're there to clean it up or do the yard or something, right? So that's in my view, a very big problem.
Just want to wheel back to a quick question. You mentioned in the South and the whole the lost cause and all that stuff. We need to remind ourselves that prior to 1860, John Brown's revolt, and there was any numbers of folks in the North and other states who were very much energized, evangelicized with the idea of breaking slavery and a man's a man for all of that. And so, it's interesting. The North was not necessarily so rational in its thinking. It also had an evangelical zeal which Mr. Lincoln was also party to, and maybe was more receptive and was able to culture his language to bring in these good folks to get something positive done. But again, as we look at where we are right now, there's evangelicals of different stripes on both sides of this discussion. Maybe not as fighting over who actually has the face or the hand of God this week, but it's the same sort of motivation that we've seen time and time again.
Yeah, a couple of important things there I would say is something we need to face is the split in the American Christian church that happened during the 19th century over slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention was essentially created as a revolt against abolitionism. You had the Baptist Church in the United States, and then as there was this movement towards abolishing slavery, the Southern Baptists created their own branch of that church, essentially to defend slavery and to defend white supremacy. And that happened in other Christian denominations as well, the Methodists and others. And that's a very dark history in the American Christian church. And we see that down to the present day. And people who are not active Christians get confused by that, and they tend to think that, well, I guess Christians are racists or something. But yeah, there's a segment of American Christianity that's essentially about white supremacy, and the creation of Christian academies, for example, in the 1970s following civil rights and school desegregation was a way of circumventing desegregation and create whites-only schools and calling them Christian academies. And that's what the point of that was. At the same time, Colin, I think you're right. We have to remember that there was a long tradition in Christianity and other religions that was against slavery, and many of our concepts of equality and why slavery is wrong come down to us in America through the Judeo-Christian tradition, even though Christianity, has a lot to answer for in other ways, I would say, and has often been used on the opposite side of the argument. And this is something else we need to come to terms with. And this is part of what I referred to earlier, where I think there's been like these three great phases in the moral history of mankind, starting with belief in gods and then a God, and then thinking that reason was the ultimate authority. And then that led to a crisis of morality because nobody could figure out what do we base morality on if it's not based on some absolute truth anymore? Because in a world of reason, it can't be. And now there was a crisis of there was existentialism, there was, deconstruction, there was absurdism, there was all kinds of stuff as essentially moral philosophy fell into a million pieces. And where we are now, I think, is what's known as emotivism, which amounts to it's right because it feels right to me. And that's essentially the morality that we have now. And I think we have to recognize that that's kind of a moral catastrophe, and it doesn't really work. And one of the bad results, and I referred to this earlier as well, is it opened the way for the market to become the new God, basically. And the way that was enacted in the history of the United States was we had the revolution where a lot of people behaved very bravely, which often happens when there's a war or when lives are at stake. People are often, strangely, at their best when they're facing death. And there was a lot of civic virtue in the United States during and immediately after the revolution, but then there was an economic boom. And then throughout the 19th century, you saw the expulsion of the Indians and the westward expansion, which opened up the opportunity to make enormous amounts of money. And I think in many ways, America lost its moral soul there. It wasn't founded as a Christian nation. They explicitly rejected the idea of an official state religion, but it was founded on a long history of Judeo-Christian values that were essentially moral. And you had people like Jonathan Edwards describing the city on a hill as an example to all mankind, et cetera, as a religious concept. In many ways, America was seen as a new Eden, a way to start over with civilization and create something that was better than corrupt old Europe. But unfortunately, as this economic boom started after the revolution, and then the enormous opportunities of wealth to be had, if we could just get rid of the Indians and take all the land and have railroads and start mining everywhere and all that stuff, at the same time as we had done away with an absolute standard of morality and replaced it with reason, which ended up just being, in the end, basically whatever I feel is right is what's right, and I'm going to call that religious freedom. Well, that opened, I think, the way to where we are now, where essentially we're just worshiping money and success, and ultimately ourselves as basically what I'm calling the Messiah in the mirror. And that's part of this moral catastrophe, I think, that we're experiencing right now. And furthermore, we've even lost the ability to discuss the problem, which is an unanticipated consequence of the Enlightenment, in my view, because in our rationalistic language, we're not really equipped with the vocabulary to talk about morality without getting uncomfortable, because it feels like we're talking about religion, and we feel like we can't talk about religion because we're pluralistic and inclusive. And I think part of the solution is going to have to be to regain a sense of comfort and moral clarity with talking about concepts like sin, not in the context of a tradition, a particular religious tradition, but or the soul, and having your soul be in jeopardy. These can be symbolic constructs. They don't have to be literally true if you're not religious. You don't have to believe that hell literally exists, for example. I actually firmly believe that Rush Limbaugh is in hell right now. I don't think we need to believe in a literal hell. I think if you read Dante, the Inferno, and look at the punishments that are visited on sinners, or you just go back to the Bible and think about hell in symbolic terms, somebody who has devoted his life to greed and self-interest and uses dishonesty and exploitation to get there is putting themselves in hell. The punishment that Dante describes for sinners is that they get what they wanted. Or they get so much of it that it's in unbearable suffering. So the fourth circle of hell, I was just writing about this the other day, so I remember which circle it was, is where the greedy are. And they're condemned to carry these enormous burdens of money and to be an endless warfare of the hoarders versus the wasters. So the people who hoard money versus the people who just spend it everywhere. And they're in constant battle for all eternity, and all they think about is money. Well, that's Rush Limbaugh, in my view. And a lot of these people, they even look to me like they're suffering, and I'm sure they convince themselves that they're having the best possible life because they've got a private jet and they're loaded and they got all these sycophants hanging around them. But now think about, if you're one of those people, anytime you're in a gathering of your friends or coworkers, you are surrounded by assholes. And if you stop and ask yourself, how come there's so many assholes around here? How come all these people are dishonest and insincere and greedy and have terrible values? Wait a minute. That's because I'm that kind of person. I'm just better at it than they are. So you're in hell as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, getting back to my point, this is an example, I think, of where we could talk about morality in a less rationalistic kind of heartless, having the heart taken out of it kind of way. And I think we need to, because we need to connect with people who don't think quite so rationally, the folks, for example, who got fooled by Trump, because they thought he was enlisting them in a grand moral crusade to save the nation. That's what a lot of them honestly believed. They thought they were behaving righteously. They thought they were battling evil on behalf of all that was good. And to reach those people, obviously they're completely mistaken rationally, but to reach them, I think part of what we have to do is expand the bandwidth of the way we talk and include more about symbolism and the heart and the soul, and reclaim a moral vocabulary that fits in the tradition of being inclusive of all forms of religion, as long as they're tolerant and fit within a democracy. But we need to reclaim that so that we can connect with people about these deep questions of morality that are not just strictly rational.
Spencer, one thought that occurs to me, you talk about the sort. This is a topic for another chat on another evening, probably. You talk about the sorts that happen in your book, and they were brought up, the sort between rich and poor and the sort between left and right. There's another sort that I think plays out, and that makes, from a political theory perspective, makes political systems unstable, which is the sort that if you have a political system that is no longer responding to the electorate, then at some point it actually becomes unstable. And we're there now at some level because, of course, we have representatives who can say almost anything and they don't actually have to be afraid of getting unelected, which would be accountability. And we don't have that because of that sort, because you can choose essentially who you're going to run for by having, all sorts of mechanisms to draw districts and so forth. So the question in my mind is to increase that bring that accountability back, we have to have some mechanisms in place. And I think it would be interesting to talk about how we can bring that level of accountability back. Because the problem when you have an unstable system, it could appear as if the people who are correct, who are on the right side of the issue, should win over time. But that's not necessarily true. You can have an unstable system where the people who are making it unstable are the winners of the instability,
right?
Which is what currently, we're at risk of happening. We've seen it happen in history time and again, that you can both fan the flames and then benefit from the fire, even if you're in the house, as it were. So I just think there would be an interesting, another discussion about sort of the stability of political system or the instability. Where do we find ourselves? Because to me, certainly as an observer who's looked at different systems around the world, I was shocked by how unstable our system is.
Yeah.
And I think many of us thought, can't happen here.
We've been counting on it being infinitely resilient, but I think that's kind of fits into my metaphor of strip mining democracy, because you kind of assume, well, we'll just move on to the next mountaintop and strip mine that one. And there'll always be plenty of new land in America for us to exploit. And then you start to realize there actually are limits. So similarly with democracy, and I think this is part of the triumph of the market, where especially the Republican Party has been taken over by folks who really only stand for nothing but power and money. And so they will just keep doing stuff like gerrymandering and shady campaign finance and exploiting racial division. All of this stuff, they'll do it just because it's legal. And, I think you're suggesting, for example, gerrymandering is a very serious problem, which is why a former Attorney General Eric Holder devoted himself to setting up, is it a foundation or a PAC? I'm not sure which, to fight gerrymandering, which is the drawing of these artificial districts named after a guy named Edmund Gary, by the way, spelled the same way, but back in the 1800s. But these crazy shaped districts, which are deliberately designed to make sure that you have safe Republican seats where these folks can never lose. Now, Democrats have done the same thing over time. Whoever's in charge at the state legislature level gets to draw the districts every 10 years. And so if it was Democrats, they would do the same thing. Republicans have turned out to be better at it. And now we are in this situation where this is a big part of why, even though Republicans very often represent a minority of the people, and even at the presidential level, a Republican has only won the popular vote in one of the last 9 elections for president, I believe it is. It was in 2004 when George Bush was reelected with a popular majority, probably because we were in the middle of a war. But this is a very big problem because these folks are supposed to be representatives, as I was saying earlier. They're supposed to represent the voters, but they don't need to. They just they're essentially choosing their own voters to guarantee the safety of their seat. And that's a terrible problem. And it shows up measurably. For example, support for reasonable gun safety regulations gets as high as 90%. And it commands a very sizable majority of members of the National Rifle Association. I forget what the figure is, but it's something on the order of 60 or 70% support for sensible gun safety regulations. And yet, maybe this will change, but you can't do anything in that area. Obama didn't even try. Obama got an F rating from the Brady Center for Gun Violence, if that's what it's called, which is a gun control group. They gave him an F because he knew it was a waste of time to even try. And, nobody can try. And yet there's a very strong majority of Americans who want to change gun laws to some extent to, do things like make it hard for terrorists and mass murderers to get guns, for example. And there's another study that I think I mentioned in the book. It was done by a guy at Brigham Young University whose name I'm forgetting, but he studied the correlation between Senate votes, I think, and opinion polls in the Senate districts, and found that, and then it compared it to campaign donations, and found that, what do you know, the people who were being represented were the campaign donors, not the voters. And that's a problem with our campaign finance system. So these are practical solutions that could have very high impact. If we fixed gerrymandering, and if we fixed campaign finance, I think it's an absurd argument to say that money is speech. I think that's just ridiculous on its face. And it's an example of making the market God again, essentially. If we fix those things, and then, the Electoral College is a heavier lift, but Vince, actually, I happen to know, is an expert on that topic, and there's some hope there. And if we made these what amount to just technocratic fixes, that could actually make a big difference in making the system more responsive and less unstable, as Vince says. And that could take a lot of the frustration and even rage out of the system that gets built up, because whether they're Trump supporters or Trump opponents, people are not crazy if they think the system isn't really working for them. It's working better than a lot of people think it is. It's not thoroughly corrupt. They're not all crooks. They're not all idiots, but they're not wrong to think there's something very seriously wrong.
Hi, Spencer. This is Rachel LaFleur. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. How you doing?
Oh, hey. I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this. I just thought this was absolutely amazing. And I'm just so enthralled to hear all of the different views on this. And did you say where we can get the book, or is the book already out?
Yeah. Yes, it is. And thanks so much, Reiko. And I don't think we've met before, have we?
No, we haven't met. We haven't met in person. I was introduced to you by Meredith Lilly. Her and I worked together at her and I worked together at General Services Administration.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, I met.
She went on, but I'm still here.
Oh, that's at the GSA you stayed there?
Yes, sir.
Oh my God, good for you. Thank you for your service, Reiko. You're one of America's heroes.
Well, thank you. But I just wanted to let you know I enjoyed it. I got on probably about 30 or 40 minutes late, but I really enjoyed this. This was just a beautiful conversation.
Oh, thank you so much.
It was so many great ideas.
From what a great group. Some of
the guests that came out of this, and I'm very excited. And it's like I almost want to do something. I don't know what to do. So hopefully you'll have some more of these.
Yeah, I will. And maybe that's one of the things we can talk about next time. And folks, Reiko mentions Meredith Lilly is a friend of mine from the 2008 Obama campaign, and we had a couple of other Obama people on earlier. And wow, what a great, and Vince worked on both campaigns as well. What a great, awesome group of people that was, and we're still connected after all these years. They're just terrific people, united by great values. So a cause for hope that can happen again. I'm going to show I have one slide to show everybody, which has some links on it, Reiko. So that question was the perfect last question, and includes the name of my book and some information about where to find me on the web. So the book is called Patriots of Two Nations. And if you Google that, you'll find it on Amazon. And as I say, I'll show you these links. And also at my website, spencercritchley.com, there's a form where you can sign up for email alerts, and I promise you I don't spam people, and if you sign up, you'll get occasional emails, but I'll never share your email address with anybody else, and I won't be hitting you with crap all the time. So anyway, let me just see if I can share my screen, and should see links and references.
Yes.
Good. So yeah, the website, my main website is spencercritchley.com, and I write there fairly frequently. There's also, if you go to there, you'll see there's a link to a contact page where you can sign up to get emails from me. I host a podcast called Dastardly Cleverness in the Service of Good. So if you have a podcast app like Apple Podcasts or any of the other ones, just search for that and you'll find it. And my book is called Patriots of Two Nations. And as I say, if you Google that, you'll find it right away. And it's available on Amazon as a Kindle or as a paperback. And then the website for the book is at mcdavidmedia.com. And there's more information about the book there, as well as excerpts from media interviews that I've done about it. So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And it's really been a pleasure for me. And I will do it again. And I will mention it on Facebook to let you know that way. And if you want to be informed by email, and if you're not already on my list, you can sign up there, and I'll let you know about it that way as well.